The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Theda Skocpol on the right-wing coalition that brought us Donald Trump and what progressives should do now. Melvin Goodman on how Trump politicized government to advance his personal agenda and how to undo it. Plus, Madeleine Albright tells Bill Press about how to repair the damage done from Trump's foreign policy. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight, and follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Theda Skocpol's most recent book explores citizen activism in the U.S., from the Tea Party to the anti-Trump resistance, and how they are transforming American politics. It documents the elite and grassroots interests that are pushing the GOP to the right, and what progressives can learn to advance their agenda in a Biden administration. And we say hello to Theda Skocpol, an American sociologist and political scientist who is currently the Victor S. Thomas Professor of Government and Sociology at Harvard University. She's also the author of numerous books, including The Tea Party and the Remaking of Republican Conservatism, co-authored with Vanessa Williamson. Theda Skocpol, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I guess more appropriately, I should say welcome back to the podcast. About a year ago or so, you also co-edited a book with Caroline Turbo titled Upending American Politics, Polarizing Parties, Ideological Elites, and Citizen Activists from the Tea Party to the Anti-Trump Resistance. And what you document is a surge in grassroots activism across the political spectrum. Beginning with the right, what did you find out about what is driving right-wing activism in this moment?
Well, it goes back to the Tea Party, but there's a through line from the Tea Party that erupted at the grassroots, as well as, of course, at the level of elites, right-wing elites, when Barack Obama was first elected president and have a Democratic Congress at the same time in 2008. There's a through line from the grassroots parts of that Tea Party movement, which ended up creating about 2,000, that's our current estimate, about 2,000 regularly meeting Tea Parties all over the United States, a through line from the people who participated in forming those groups and their outlook on the world to Donald Trump. In fact, I remember Vanessa Williamson and I were doing our interviews of Tea Party activists, people participating and leading those grassroots groups in the spring of 2011 when the previous presidential cycle was getting going. And that's when ordinary Tea Party people were looking for a non-Mitt Romney, and they were very intrigued with Donald Trump when he came out with his birther accusations against President Barack Obama. I think in many ways we found that grassroots Tea Partiers were most worried about the social and cultural changes in the country, and above all, angry about immigration. And so the kind of ethno-nationalist and in-your-face politics that Donald Trump perfected as a candidate and certainly as president was thrilling to them then and has remained so to those who are still with us. These are older people. And of course, millions more have joined their ranks, not necessarily grassroots activists, but just voters.
Yeah, they definitely got their guy when you look at it that way. Do you see the rise in right-wing activism is primarily a top-down movement or a bottom-up, or is it some combination of both?
That's the thing. It's both. And I think one of the chapter I wrote for Upending American Politics on the dual roots of Republican radicalization or Republican extremism, try to get at this. Starting in the early 2000s, you had the construction of an ultra free market quasi-political party, political machine, the Koch network, which is sometimes understood as just the brothers giving a lot of money. And that's just not the way to look at it. My colleagues and I study organizations and networks. And what was special about the Koch network was they constructed this vast federated network that took over at the state level, as well as had a big role in national politics. By the time Obama was elected, it was up and running. And it pushed Republican candidates and office holders almost everywhere in the country to adopt this total anti-tax, anti-regulation, anti-global warming, union-busting style of politics, which actually wasn't that popular with a lot of ordinary Republican voters who tend to be, people sometimes say working class. I don't think that's quite right. I think they're often middle-income people in construction trades, small business owners, people who work for those kinds of businesses, above all, people who don't live in metropolitan areas or metropolitan suburbs. For them, the number one issues all along have been right to life, anti-gay rights, anger about immigration and racial and generational changes in American society and culture. But so there are these two strands, one of which is Tea Party and more populist driven, and the other of which is elite driven. And the elite radicals hollowed out the Republican Party, captured their candidates and their office holders with policies that really didn't appeal that much to the priorities of the grassroots. And then Trump came along and thrilled the grassroots. And under Trump's presidency, we sort of had a fusion of both kinds of radicalism. And I say radicalism for two reasons. One, these are not popular with most Americans. So, I mean, that's just a fact. It doesn't mean they're not popular with a big chunk of Americans, the grassroots priorities. They are. And they are also extreme in the sense that more and more Republican supporters and office holders are willing to forego basic small d democratic practices in order to further their sense of what it takes to save America. And they really do believe they're saving America, both sets of actors.
Yeah. And you said also in another interview that the GOP is now almost unrecognizable. How has the party changed after 4 years of Trump and why? But also, is this a party simply playing out to what they believe voters want? Or do they, or do you believe rather, there is a larger political agenda actually playing out?
Well, I think both are going on. And, you know, part of the reason for the kind of analysis that I'm offering is to get beyond these oversimplifications that try to find one root for everything. That kind of thinking exists on the left, too. And frankly, that's not the way the world works. I do think we've got these two forms of radicalism that have taken over the Republican Party, both electorally and in terms of the funding and the agenda setting. Both strands are increasingly that they know that in full and fair elections, they will probably not win, just like they didn't win in this election,
right?
At the presidential level. And I am not of the school of thought that says that Mitch McConnell is, quote, afraid of the grassroots. I mean, I think to some degree he is, but he's trying to use this ethno-nationalist anger, this Trump anger, and this attachment to Donald Trump as a person through the Twitter universe to further, the right-wing judges, the big tax cuts for the wealthy, the blocking of any kind of regulations, and making sure that Joe Biden, like he tried before with Barack Obama, is a failed president. They will try to block any kind of economic stimulus that reaches ordinary people because they don't want Joe Biden to be anything more than a one-term president. And they don't want gains for Democrats in Congress. And they have a lot going for them in this project because the Electoral College and the Senate and the geography of the country mean that their supporters, even though they're minorities of both donors and I mean, they're a big share of donors, but they're minorities and they're pushing minority causes. they have a lot of leverage in the system, and they're trying to lock in Republican autocratic rule. Many of the elites that are funding all this, Koch network people, and I've talked to some of them, they don't really like the anti-immigrant bias. They don't like the crudeness of Donald Trump. Donald Trump himself is basically a patrimonial ruler trying to get favors for his family and cronies. So, but they are perfectly willing to put up with that if it achieves the minority, locks in the minority rule through the courts and through the Senate that they want.
And that always leaves me scratching my head, because that's a lot to put up with. But now that Trump will no longer be in the White House, there is a lot of speculation and concern that Trumpism will continue to have a deep impact on American politics. How do you understand what Trumpism even means right now? And are you concerned about its future?
Well, I'm thinking about this because I have to write about it soon. And, David Frum, who's a conservative writer, pretty good one, says I think he's written that there is no Trumpism without Trump. I don't think there's any Trumpism in the sense of a coherent ideology. I do think that Trump himself is so obsessed with personal advantage short term and with advantaging families and people who flatter him that he is not a very strong reed to rely on once he's out of the White House for organizing any kind of coherent movement going forward. And I would not be surprised if he begins to lose his allure when he does not have the power, the levers of the federal government at his disposal. However, we just learned that he's raised more than $170 million with this Twitter feed and the right-wing media and this fraud argument about the election. He will continue to have an adoring following, and he will use that following to harry the Republican Party's candidates. But he's likely to use it for personal advantage, and that's going to create problems for those who would like to continue the sort of ultra free market economic program and are willing to do a little bit of continuing concessions to the Christian right and to ethno-nationalists as a price to pay for that. But they probably would like to do it without Trump. I just don't know how easy Trump is going to make it on the Republican Party. I have to say, I think Joe Biden is the only Democrat who could have prevailed in this extremely terrifying election. This is the most consequential election since 1860 or maybe 1876. I'd have to go back and do my history a little more. And I know that a lot of people on the left have never been thrilled with him, but his ability to convey a sense of steadiness and dignity and signal that he would respect Republicans who wanted to defect from some of this. And there are, maybe a quarter of Republican identifiers are not on board with the full package here. It was just very important because Democrats just cannot create a Tea Party of the left. However much Justice Democrats dreams of that, it cannot happen because of the way in which the political geography of the United States works. You have to be able to carry the likes of Michigan and Pennsylvania, or if not that, Arizona, which is not a particularly lefty place. So you have to be able to put together a coalition that stretches from the center to the liberals to the progressives. And you have to find policies and ways forward that people can all get on board with, or mostly get on board with. And I think, Biden has the best chance of doing that, but he's going to be doing it on circumstances in which he's won a commanding presidential victory. It really was a commanding victory. Huge turnout and more than 80 million votes, and really flipped a couple of key conservative states and got back the 3, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, by bigger margins than Trump won them. And yet he doesn't have the Senate unless Georgia works out. Maybe it will, but I don't fully understand what's going on there. But it's not likely. And the House, my goodness, the House majority is down to bare bones. So he's going to have to thread quite a needle here in order to avoid losses in the next two elections. And it's going to take at least the next two elections to put this ethno-nationalist radicalism into a box.
Daunting thoughts. We're speaking with Theda Skocpol, American sociologist, political scientist, Victor S. Thomas Professor of Government and Sociology at Harvard University, and as we mentioned, the author of numerous books, including co-authored with Vanessa Williamson, The Tea Party and the Remaking of Republican Conservatism. So we'll turn to the left now and kind of keep going with that same theme that you're talking about. And we see activism across such a wide range of issues. But do you see some central ideas that link these activists together that, although you said it's not going to be a Tea Party type of formation for the left, can you link these together and as a group be stronger?
Well, I do think the 2018 elections are a good model. That was the first midterm after Trump was elected, and it was also pre-pandemic. And that meant you could have grassroots activists of many different types going all out to contact people, to run for office, to get voters out. I studied the state of Pennsylvania, and we wrote about that in Upending American Politics. And that's an interesting state because it's got everything from New York to Alabama in one state. And, it really, yes, young people and left progressives mobilized in some of the big city areas. But it was these college-educated women, overwhelmingly white, who organized the grassroots resistance groups that were thick on the ground in all of the suburban collar counties around Philly and the suburban areas of Allegheny County around Pittsburgh, and had a presence in the vast middle of the state, enough to change the margins. And a lot of them are left progressive in their thinking. Not all of them. They included everything from disgruntled Republicans to independents to mainstream liberals. But a lot of them would have liked Elizabeth Warren, for example, to be the nominee. Or there were Bernie Sanders people. In my experience, the Bernie Sanders people would usually stand up and give speeches at meetings, and then not. The women were the ones who were really getting down to things. But they made a big difference. But the point I want to make is they made a big difference by running candidates that fit different districts. They didn't demand one big ideological program. And because it wasn't a presidential contest, there wasn't as much focus on one big message. And they ended up electing a very diverse array of people that stretched from the left of the Democratic Party to the center of the political spectrum, disproportionately women and minorities, but a lot of savvy men like Jared Golden in northern Maine, he's an ex-Marine. He has a message and an ability to connect to a district that really is anything but super liberal. He just got reelected, by the way, in a situation where that district went for Trump. So I think that has to happen again. My feeling is that instead of spending a lot of time arguing about who Joe Biden puts in his cabinet, pick out a couple of people to have a fight about, but frankly, the miracle is going to be to get that past Mitch McConnell. Instead, focus on reactivating the grassroots and thinking about the 2022 midterm elections, making sure there's a broad array of people from moderate liberals to left progressives that fit their districts, that are in contact with groups that hopefully in that election, unlike this one, can go door to door again. There was a lot of door to door in 2018 that did not happen in this election because of the pandemic, and needs to happen again because many people need to be kind of reminded to vote down ballot. What happened in this election, I suspect, is a lot of people voted for Biden but did not vote down ballot. And so you need to replenish the state legislatures, the local governments, the Congress. And if that happens, then 2024 will take care of itself. Either Biden will run again or somebody else from this broad array of people in their 50s will capture the nomination. We don't have to figure that out yet. I think there's a real a grassroots opposition that recaps what the resistance did in 2018, that keeps in touch with the representatives and pushes them to do the most they can, but does not fight against compromise, because compromises are going to be necessary. And a style of left advocacy that just screams at people in Congress and tells them they're not doing enough, which unfortunately there are people in offices in Washington and New York and San Francisco, I'm sure, who engage in that kind of leftism. That is not going to work in this period.
But again, with Trump no longer in the White House, there is some concern that without Trump, activism on the left will lose some of its steam. Do you share that concern?
Well, apparently Kamala Harris was asked about this the other day, about Trump saying he would run again for 2024. And she said, "Oh, please," and burst out laughing. I don't think Trump personally is going to step back in a way that would benefit Republicans. I think he's going to keep sticking his mug into the situation for quite a while. So he'll be there as a useful foil, not to the same degree. But, Mitch McConnell and the Republican Congress our Senate are going to do plenty to block things. And it is really, really important that the Biden administration make them pay to the degree that they can, deftly. I don't think Biden has to get up there and say, "I'll never talk to them again." That's not Joe Biden. In any event, most voters don't want to hear that. Most voters want to hear, I know it sounds naive to people on the left, but most people want to hear that you'll work together. However, you can behind the scenes make it clear to some of these people in Congress what carrots they'll get if they go along and what sticks they'll get if they don't. And I do see the pandemic economic recovery as a better situation than 2008 and 2009, because it's going to be delivering a vaccine, making sure that there's support for state and local governments to do that, find some ways to build some economic stimulus into that, make it almost impossible for Republicans to vote against all of that without paying a price. But it does mean you got to call them out publicly and make it highly visible to the public if they try to block things. I have a feeling that the Biden team is going to do that. I have a feeling that they have learned some lessons from what happened to Barack Obama in 2009 and 2010. Mm-hmm. And I'm, somewhat optimistic, but that's where a broad grassroots movement can echo the argument, can keep the focus on the obstruction, can just say the reason we can't have X that we all want. It's sort of going back to what they did with defending the Affordable Care Act in the 2017 period. A lot of people who defended the Affordable Care Act in the first year of Trump's presidency wanted Medicare for all. Biden heard them, by the way. Biden's plan of adding a public option that anybody could buy into would get us to Medicare for all within 10 years, if that can get through Congress. So there is something to fight for. Biden's policies are actually quite progressive. They find ways to hit a sweet spot in the Democratic Party. But an echo chamber and a supportive operation at the grassroots across the country can help to get the message out in a way that just relying on television ads or presidential campaigns cannot do. Mm-hmm. There's a big role for civic action in this period if people keep at it.
Another issue here, and you've done considerable scholarship on the issue of public trust in government. And it's hard to imagine a president that has done more to undermine that trust than Trump. Yeah. How deep is the damage and how do we move forward?
We move forward by making sure that the Biden presidency is able to have some visible successes in delivering things people need, ordinary people need in this period, which is a robust economic recovery with some decent opportunities for jobs that have been sidelined, people that have been sidelined, and an effective delivery of this vaccine, which really is important. In some ways, recovery from this crisis offers a chance for, and I would also say, just ignore Trump and get a broad infrastructure bundle out there. that includes things like, community facilities and internet, high-speed internet for the whole country, things that everyone can see. You can't talk to people about trust in government as if you were in an academic classroom. You have to show them that government can do something that they need and care about. And then the trust will begin to be rebuilt.
President Biden will need to restore trust in the government by working within the left and the right? Fair to say? Not
the right, but the left and the center. And remember, there are about somewhere between, I would say around a quarter of Republican identifiers who didn't like the Trump presidency for a whole variety of reasons and are not necessarily going to become Democrats, but they are going to be open to some degree of cooperation. For example, Biden's early move before the transition was even authorized by the woman at the General Services Administration, he invited 5 governors, 5 Republican governors, or 10 governors, I think it was, 5, but evenly balanced between Republican and Democratic governors. And sure, some of the Republican governors were your usual suspects from Massachusetts. These are really moderate Democrats, and Maryland, but there was also Governor DeWine from, I noticed that the governor of Alabama, who's pretty extreme on the right, was there. Working with governors and mayors is a good idea, but especially governors, because they really do have to deliver. They can't just bloviate. And Biden, among other things, said to them he would reimburse them for the charges of using the National Guard. Now, somebody on the left might look at that and say, wait a minute, we don't want to be doing that. Yes, we do, because Congress will not be able to vote against subsidizing the National Guard. It's a way to get money into states. They won't be able to say no to that. And the National Guard will have to be used probably for some of the distribution of the vaccines, which is a big project. It's going to take a long time. It's not just once. It's going to be going on for 6 to 8 months. So that's a very clever way, which I'm sure Biden is quite aware of making it, of doing what Nancy Pelosi was trying to do, which is to get subsidies for state and local governments, but doing it in a way that the Republicans will not be able to say no to. So that's where people at the grassroots have got to be smart. They've got to look beyond the labels and look at the real substance of the policy moves that are made, because they're going to have to be policy moves that defang the far right, that divide the Republican Party. You want to divide the Republican Party. You want to create situations where McConnell cannot control 3 or 4 senators who will vote. And I think that's very possible. But that's going to be deft, and that they can do it, but it's going to require people on the left to calm down about slogans that are scary to middle America.
Okay. Theda Skocpol, Victor S. Thomas, professor of government and sociology at Harvard University, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Also, of course, as we mentioned, co-author with Vanessa Williamson of The Tea Party and the Remaking of Republican Conservatism. Theda, as always, we appreciate your time with us today. Would love to have you back and talk about this again soon. In fact, maybe before the next 2 years and the next 4 years are up.
Okay, happy to do it.
Thanks very much. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, Trump's 4-year effort to transform government to serve his own interest. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
The U.S. Department of Agriculture. What is it, and why does it matter? Created in 1862 by Abraham Lincoln to be what he called the People's Department, today this little-known agency has enormous tools and resources to restore fairness and opportunity across America's countryside. It has major anti-monopoly authority, controls huge rural development and housing programs, runs food stamps, school lunch, and other nutrition programs, has responsibility for pesticide regulations, directs the Forest Service and numerous other environmental programs, has sweeping civil and labor rights responsibilities, wields a $151 billion annual budget, has 100,000 employees, and an office in every county in America. And, most powerfully, the Secretary has broad authority to be a national advocate for the people against the corporate plutocracy now controlling policy. Ag Secretary is a big office, but tools only work if you use them. President-elect Biden rightly promised to restore trust that our national government will serve the public interest rather than continuing policies that abet oligarchic power and increase inequality. Here is a clear test of that promise. Instead of recycling another old-line agribusiness acolyte into USDA, Biden must be pushed to make a progressive choice for Secretary of Agriculture, someone unencumbered by financial or political ties to the status quo, willing to practice what Representative John Lewis called getting into good trouble, necessary trouble. This is Jim Hightower saying, at minimum, the next Secretary of Agriculture should pledge to rally family farmers, workers, consumers, rural communities, and urban neighborhoods in a common effort to break the corporate stranglehold and turn USDA into the People's Department again.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Melvin Goodman's 42-year government career includes service at the CIA, Department of State, Department of Defense, and the U.S. Army. He says Trump has weaponized the national security state in unprecedented ways. Here is a conversation from early December. And we say hello to Melvin A. Goodman, a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy in Washington, D.C., and an adjunct professor of international relations at Johns Hopkins University. He's also the author of numerous books, including American Carnage, The Wars of Donald Trump, and Whistleblower at the CIA, an insider's account of the politics of intelligence. Mel Goodman, thanks so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats Podcast.
Thank you, Jim. Good to be with you.
Nice to have you with us. You recently also wrote an op-ed titled Trump's Weaponization of the National Security State. And there you detail Trump's 4-year effort to transform government. Beginning with the Department of Justice, how has it changed under Donald Trump?
Well, I think we've seen a level of politicization by Trump that we've never seen before, certainly not in modern American history. in which all of the key agencies of government have been politicized to a certain extent and even weaponized to advance the personal agenda of Donald Trump. So normal governance, normal government process has been ignored. And when you look at the intelligence community, you get total politicization by the Director of National Intelligence. When you look at domestic agencies such as education, housing and urban development, they've been neutralized by people who are not really experts in those particular fields. And in justice, William Barr has essentially become the enabler in chief. He has become Trump's personal lawyer. He's intervened in cases involving Michael Flynn and Roger Stone. So there's tremendous rehabilitation that will have to take place.
You also write about the Department of Homeland Security, which you describe as the personal militia of the President of the United States. So how have we seen that play out?
Well, I'm not a fan of Homeland Security in the first place. It never should have been created. It was over a reaction to 9/11. It has too many agencies within it with disparate priorities and requirements. And when you look at it, it's got half of the federal law enforcement officers in the entire government are at Homeland Security. And we saw this brought to bear when there were peaceful protests in places such as Portland and Seattle. We've seen how ICE has moved into so-called sanctuary cities to complicate the immigration problem. So to that extent, it has become a personal militia, particularly under Chad Wolf, who was in an acting capacity and essentially in violation of the Federal Vacancies Act because he's been in that capacity for much too long and has never been in a position confirmed by the Senate. This is, I think, a way to circumvent the constitutional requirement for congressional advice and consent on formal appointments within the government.
And of course, you mentioned the intelligence agencies, and Trump has brought them into his service. But stepping back from the specifics of each department and agency, what's the overall impact of Trump's actions?
Well, the overall impact is to weaken the intelligence community. I think the key to me was the summit meeting that he held with Vladimir Putin, when he took Putin's word for the fact that Russia didn't interfere in the US election. So he ignored the intelligence community. So when he did that, he really maligned the credibility and the integrity of the intelligence community and accepted the remarks of a very devious Russian leader who's well known for perfidy in various international situations. And then when you look at the director of national intelligence, particularly under John Ratcliffe, the current director of national intelligence, this has been outright politicization on who is involved in the American election and who is really responsible. And I know from my sources at CIA that they're very hesitant to send certain kinds of sensitive information to the president of the United States because they don't know what he'll do with it.
That in itself, of course, very scary. And, we should note that Trump's not done yet. Before he leaves office, Trump's carrying out sweeping changes within the Defense Department. He's removed several of its most senior officers, replaced them with perceived loyalists to himself. How do you understand the rationale behind these moves, and what are your concerns about their possible impact?
Well, the initial concern was that he was going after the Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, because Esper decided that the use of the military in involvement with peaceful protests was wrong. And even Esper made a mistake when he referred to American cities as battle space. That was shocking to me. It's a violation of the Posse Comitatus Act of 1877, but I've never heard a Secretary of Defense refer to American cities as battle space. But then when the move was continued, it turned into a purge of the top leaders of the Department of Defense, including the Chief of Staff, the Undersecretary for Policy, the Undersecretary for Intelligence. If it weren't the United States, if it were another country, I would say this is preparation for a coup. Now, that seems a little far-reaching, but what it does suggest is that Trump wants to take a decision that he wants these sycophants at the Department of Defense, particularly people like General Tata, and there are others, to carry out orders that the military right now feel are excessive and maybe beyond the law. And my chief worry is Iran. To what extent did Trump make changes at the Defense Department in order to pursue military options with regard to Iran, which he discussed with the military, and they appeared to disabuse him of those ideas. But just the other day, you had the Israeli assassination of a nuclear scientist outside of Tehran, You have to think that Israel probably touched base with the United States. I'm not saying the United States was involved in the assassination attempt, but for my 24 years at CIA, Israel has never carried out a military operation without waiving it by the United States, either for some sign of approval or some concurrence or cooperation. The United States and Israel have cooperated against the Iran nuclear program. So that's my chief concern. Is there a military operation that Trump is going to pursue in these last days?
And Mel, there has been mostly silence from leading Republicans as Trump has made these moves. Are you surprised by that at all?
Well, given the 4 years, I'm not surprised, but I'm shocked. I mean, to have so many invertebrates in one political party at one time is shocking to me. You've had a few speak out, particularly Mitt Romney. I give him tremendous credit for that. But basically, they have shown total intimidation. It's been like a group of troglodytes who are going to allow Donald Trump to do anything he wants, even if it weakens our democracy, even if it weakens the rule of law, even if it weakens our elections and the integrity of our elections. And that is shocking.
And not to mention our international standing. I mean, it's just there's not an area that this guy has not chipped away at. We're speaking with Melvin Goodman, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Policy in Washington, D.C., Adjunct Professor of International Relations at Johns Hopkins University, and author of numerous books, American Courage, The Wars of Donald Trump, and Whistleblower at the CIA, an insider's account of the politics of intelligence among them. Mel, turning now to the person who will inherit this mess. What can Joe Biden do to undo Trump's weaponization of the national security state?
Well, he can do a lot. And I would argue it's not so much institutions, it's the people who at the top of these institutions, and I think it was Ronald Reagan who said personnel is policy. So if you look at the personnel that Trump put into place, he created the worst cabinet in the history of the United States. I don't think there's any debate about that, which accompanies the fact that he's probably the worst president who ever governed the United States. So changing the personnel, getting people with experience, getting people with expertise, getting people with institutional integrity is essential. And I think by and large, and I have a couple quibbles and concerns, but by and large, if you look at his appointments in the national security field, and I put Janet Yellen as Secretary of Treasury because she's part of that when you think of the internationalization of American policy, that was an incredibly smart and somewhat surprising appointment. No one really expected that. I think Anthony Blinken at State will revive the morale at the State Department. I have some slight concerns about Blinken because he was a supporter of that terrible idea to use military force against Libya in 2011, which has become such a terrible 10-year disaster. Jake Sullivan at the National Security Council is not only an extremely bright and clever, I think, foreign policy expert, but he was at John Kerry's side when they negotiated the excellent Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear accord. So I think what Sullivan can do, just as one individual, is revive the national security process at the National Security Council, which fell into total disabuse. It didn't exist under the various national security advisors of Donald Trump. I think the fact that he hasn't appointed someone to defense, it's the real absence here in these appointments thus far, suggests there's probably some pushback going on, at least I hope so, against Michelle Flournoy. My concern with Michelle Flournoy, who everyone believes is the conventional choice for Department of Defense, is that she's really a product of the military-industrial community. I think the military-industrial community and the whole national security mindset needs to be changed. We've relied too much on operational tempo of the military. We've intervened too much. We've wasted money in pursuing wars where there are no national security interests. So I would like to see a reformer. Now, that's probably not going to be possible for this administration, but at least someone like Jay Johnson, who ran the Department of Homeland Security, would be preferable to someone like Michelle Flournoy. And I would say the same thing for CIA, where the conventional choice is Mike Morrell. Mike Morrell would be a disaster. To send someone to the CIA as director, he had formerly been acting director and deputy director of the CIA, who's an apologist for torture and abuse, just creates cynicism. I was at the CIA when Robert Gates was returned to the CIA after politicizing intelligence. So I know the kind of cynicism that forms within the organization and outside the organization when someone who has been corrupt, Gates was obviously corrupt. Morell, I think, was corrupt when he tried to explain away or whitewash torture and abuse. This would be the wrong appointment. And I think he should look outside the CIA. I would like to see an outside of the box appointment. And my candidate there is a former Deputy Secretary of State, William Burns, who's now the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He would be an excellent director of the CIA because he understands what strategic policy is, and he understands how strategic intelligence helps the formation of strategic policy. And we've never had someone with that kind of background as a director of CIA. So personnel changes will mean a lot, but then you have to do some out-of-the-box thinking. And I'm not sure Blinken's capable of that, but I think he should bring in people to look at China in a different way. China needs to be addressed in a diplomatic way. The idea that we're going to use the Pentagon and changes in tactical military strategy to deal with China, I think is just absurd. China is not the Soviet Union. It can't be contained. It was easy to contain the Soviet Union. They were sort of a third world country that happened to have nuclear weapons. China is a serious regional and international power. And they've moved very adroitly, very cleverly when you look at the Belt and Road Initiative. So I'd like to see some out-of-the-box thinking there. So there's tremendous room for change, and a good place to start to signal that Biden understands all these is arms control and disarmament. Trump is the first president since Eisenhower to totally weaken the arms control community and the arms control agenda. So what Biden has to do is to get back to the New START agreement, which expires in January or February of 2021. We should get back to the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. We should get back to the Open Skies Treaty. We should get back to something George W. Bush did that was outrageous, which was to abrogate the anti-ballistic missile treaty. So there's a lot he can do. And in arms control, that's how you improve bilateral relations. The key to Soviet-American détente that people never really recognized was arms control. It was arms control that enabled the good relationship between Reagan and Gorbachev to form that led to so much change in the international community that was beneficial to the United States. So that's what I would like to see Biden take a hack at.
He certainly has his work cut out for him, that's for sure. You were talking about the CIA. Obviously, you got a lot of background there, and your book, Whistleblower at the CIA, offers a fascinating glimpse into the secret, behind-the-scenes world of U.S. intelligence and underscored why whistleblowing is so important in keeping the system honest. How important have whistleblowers been during the Trump administration, and what has been the impact of his efforts to silence them?
Well, I can think of several key whistleblowers who perform vital service to the public, to the entire citizenry. I think of the CIA whistleblower at the National Security Council, who informed us of the details of the wrong-minded call that Trump had with Ukrainian President Zelensky, which he tried to hold him up for political reasons to hurt Joe Biden as an opponent in the presidential campaign. I can think of the whistleblower at Health and Human Services, Rick Bright, who was appalled by the handling of COVID-19 and the vaccine program and all of the safety measures that were needed and finally went public. And the fact that he is now on Biden's COVID-19 team tells you a lot. And the woman at Homeland Security, Olivia Troy, and her work in exposing all of the unconscionable activities that the Department of Homeland Security engaged in with regard to immigration, particularly the separation of families at the border. You know, there's been some unconscionable activities like selling out the Syrian Kurds, separation of families at the border, going after environmental laws at a time when you have a pandemic that's attacking our lungs is almost criminal in its intent. So whistleblowers have been vital in that regard. My concern is that, well, there may have been more, but when you look at Trump's, the way he has gone after the whistleblowers and almost legitimized attempts on their life. I know the CIA whistleblower gets protection. Security often drives him to work or takes him home. Occasionally, he has to register in a hotel. So he doesn't go home at night because there have been death threats. And I think Trump has really been the accelerant of these death threats by referring to these people as spies committing treason. So whistleblowers are important. But another thing that doesn't get enough attention is the damage Trump has done to inspectors general in the government. These are the mechanism for internal insight, oversight and investigation. And he's gone after the inspector general at the Department of National Intelligence, at the Department of Defense, at the Department of State, at Health and Human Services, at Department of Transportation. He's been very thorough in this regard. Someone has been directing him, I think, in this activity, but it's been quite damaging. And Biden's going to have to rebuild that institution. And frankly, Obama's record on the IG issue is not very liberal or progressive to begin with. So Biden's got to do better than Obama. He will certainly do better than Trump, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done.
Okay. Melvin Goodman, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Policy in Washington, D.C., Adjunct Professor of International Relations at Johns Hopkins University, and as we were just talking about, author of Whistleblower at the CIA, an insider's account of the politics of intelligence. Mel, thanks so much for your time with us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Would love to have you back and talk more about this soon.
I would like to. Thank you very much, Jim. Good being with you.
You as well. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright on the state of U.S. foreign policy after 4 years of Trump and what Biden can do to restore America's role in the world.
This book is different than your other books. I've read 2 or 3 of your other books, interviewed you about a couple of them. You know, in this one, you really kind of let your hair down. Tell a lot of great stories. Kind of bouncing around all over. It must have been fun for you to write.
Well, it was. And the reason I decided to write it is that, and I kind of say it right up front, people ask me how I want to be remembered. And I say, I don't want to be remembered. I'm still here. But as I try to explain to people what I'm doing now and why I'm doing all the different things, it does try to explain what I'm doing and how they knit together. And how, and I've also said, and you've heard me say this, is that I always think that what I need to be doing at the moment should be more interesting than what I did before. Not easy if you've been Secretary of State, but I really am doing a lot of interesting things, and I try to relate how they go together. And then I tell stories about the things that have happened to me, and it surprises people that I actually have a sense of humor. So I have to try that out.
Well, you know, I thought I knew you pretty well, and I follow you pretty well, but I was just blown away by how many things you are involved in. There is hardly a board or commission on the face of the planet that you have not either founded or you're on the board of or the head of. I mean, did you ever learn to say no?
No, I can't say no. That's not my thing, which is actually why I'm having such a terrible time now, because I'm an extrovert and I've here been under house arrest and I'm trying to learn to be an introvert, and I'm finding that hard. But the whole thing really did begin as we were leaving the State Department, and people were saying, well, are you going to go back to teaching, or are you going to give speeches, or are you going to write a book, or what about the National Democratic Institute that you've loved so much? And how about starting a business? And I said, fine, all of them. And that I wouldn't choose. And I really do believe this, Bill, is that they go together, and what I do in one place informs another. And so I like doing what I'm doing.
They all do fit together. Now, you know, we all learned, those of us who sort of do this for a living, that part of the price of talking about our new book is that we always are asked questions about the news of the day. So I want to circle back to the book and stories. But let's start with a little bit. How would you assess the state of American foreign policy today after almost 4 years of Donald Trump?
I think it's a mess. That's a diplomatic term of art. And I am just getting ready to teach in the fall semester, and I say foreign policy is just trying to get some country to do what you want. So what are the tools? And I teach this course called the National Security Toolbox, and I've done it ever since I left office. And I basically am sitting here, Bill, thinking about how I'm going to teach it this semester. It'll be virtual, but I do think that this is not the America that I know or the one that I represented, because the United States is AWOL in an awful lot of places. We're not playing the role that I believe we should. President Clinton was the first one who said we were the indispensable nation. It's just that I said it so often, it became identified with me. But there's nothing about the word indispensable that says alone. It's being a partner and being engaged, and we're certainly not doing that. So I am very troubled by where our foreign policy is and America's role in the world at the moment.
And we know we've talked about this because you have this group of former foreign ministers, heads of state like yourself. What do they tell, and you're in touch with them and you meet often, what do they tell you about America's leadership today?
Well, we see each other virtually now a number of times, and they basically are surprised, wondering where we are and why we're not more involved. And by the way, I was at a meeting in March, before this all started, really, at the Munich Security Conference, where I've gone a number of years, and where there are a number of former foreign ministers and a number of other dignitaries. And Pompeo and Esper spoke, and they were like from outer space. That it didn't really make any sense to what the other people had been saying about the responsibilities of the system, what's happening to NATO, how we need to relate each other on the economy, and how we deal with cyber, for instance. I mean, just mostly they were so focused on how important the United States was.
And how would you say, or how would you again assess specifically our relationship with Russia?
Well, I think a mixed bag, frankly. I mean, I do think that Trump and Putin do have some kind of a special relationship, and they do talk to each other. It's hard to know from the outside what they really talk about. I do think that we are, as a country, concerned about the kinds of things that the Russians are doing by really trying to separate us from our friends and allies in Europe, and what they're doing in the Middle East, where they are systematically, as we prepare to leave, they are systematically exerting their influence there. I'm not, the thing that's hard for me, Bill, is I don't know what are the kinds of things that there's some agreement on that is taking place, whether there are really diplomats trying to work some things out, or whether it's all kind of ad hoc. So from the outside, it looks like kind of a hit or miss relationship where the Russians are actually trying to undermine what we're doing. And when I read the national security strategy, which, by the way, the Trump administration put out earlier than most, but they did see Russia and China and Iran and North Korea as the major threats, but certainly Russia and China.
Do you see our relationship today with China? It seems to be hot or cold, equally murky to read.
I think it's very hard. The only thing that I just see is that it's about as bad as we've ever publicly seen. There's always, by the way, there's always something negative about China in our presidential campaigns. But I don't think I've ever seen things as genuinely unpleasant as they are now. Obviously, with the blaming for the virus, and then things that the Chinese are doing in the South and East China Sea, the other things that they're doing through their very large Belt and Road Initiative. I keep saying the Chinese must be getting very fat because the belt keeps getting larger and larger. But I do think that the relationship is particularly bad at this moment.
Right. Can we recover? And how long would it take?
I do think we can recover. The thing that's interesting about statecraft is that you have to try to look for things in which you can cooperate with a country and those where you're not going to compromise, and that there is really a struggle of some kind where you can't cooperate, where you're competing. And I do think what has happened, though, is that as we have ceded place, the Chinese are taking up the area in many different ways, some physical and some kind of what's happening with the World Health Organization, for instance, as we've decided to pull out. They are acting more and more. So they are taking up the vacuum space. But I do think that we can and should cooperate with them on climate change and also on trying to sort out some of the issues that are there internationally. But we will compete in terms of what they're doing in the South and East China Sea and for navigation rights and trying to figure out how we operate together. So, but that is statecraft.
Are you in touch with Joe Biden or his top advisors?
I am, yes. I've been friends with Joe Biden for a long time. When he was in the Senate and I was in office, he was so unbelievably, truly supportive and helpful of foreign policy, really has a very deep understanding of it. And what I really like about him, among other things, is his understanding of how domestic and foreign policy go together, which is something, whether you're in the executive or legislative branch, that's important in terms of how our policies are thought up and then how they're carried out. And so I have been in touch with him.
What would you expect to see, or what should we expect to see day one, the new Joe Biden administration?
Well, I think he has said some things where he's really going to come out with an economic plan that he really wants to do something strongly about that. That he does think that there has been a whole group of people that have been left out of the burgeoning economy and health programs and education. I think also that he will certainly get congratulatory phone calls from the foreign leaders, many of whom he really knows well because he dealt with them, and that they will establish relationships. And I'm hoping that he will make, and there's every reason to think this, is that he will understand the importance of a partnership internationally, which is good for the American people as we deal with international problems. And really, I hope that he will really refurbish our image and work with other countries for our good. That's what the President of the United States is supposed to protect: our people, our territory, and our way of life. And that requires partnership with other countries. And that is something that Joe Biden knows how to do very, very well.
Paris Climate Accords?
It's hard to resurrect it completely, but he clearly understands the importance of climate change and how it affects the populations and our industries and everything. So I think that he truly is probably the most knowledgeable person to be ready to become President of the United States when you think about the various things that he's done in his life.
And the Iran nuclear accord, is it possible to resurrect that, to restart it?
Well, I think that it has to be looked at again. I'm very troubled by the things that have happened in the last couple of months, where it's evident that the Iranians are, in fact, doing something to restore their enrichment capabilities, and where there is action or non-action in the Security Council trying to figure out what to do about the sanctions. But I think one of the huge mistakes by the Trump administration was pulling out unilaterally from that agreement, and the way that it not only affected us, but our allies and obviously the whole situation in the Middle East.
And finally, a little lightning round of your response to some people who are on the world stage today. Just a couple of comments about each, if you agree. Let's start with Secretary of State Pompeo. How do you rate the job he's doing?
I think a little mixed, frankly. I have not talked to him at all, except for the first day. when I congratulated him.
And he fired you from some advice?
Well, he fired me from, I was on the CIA External Advisory Board that Leon Panetta had asked me to be on. And then I was kept by Petraeus and Brennan and everybody. And it wasn't until all of a sudden I got a call from Pompeo. But I think that part of the problem is that there needs to be some predictability in our foreign policy. And I think Trump makes it hard for the Secretary of State to be predictable and at the same time to have a functioning relationship. But the kinds of things that have been happening, I think, do not speak really well for the kind of really organized kind of national security policy that one would like to see.
How about Bibi Netanyahu?
Very difficult person, and somebody that I used to have to keep telling President Clinton, just because he sounds like an American, he is not an American political person, and we treat him as if he were in many ways. I think that I did not enjoy working with him, I have to say, and I'm very troubled by some of the things that are going on. I'm a great supporter of Israel, but I do think that I'm worried about the annexation program or plan, and just the way that he treats the neighbors.
What was his problem with Obama? I was covering the White House. I couldn't understand. It seemed to me that Obama was giving him everything he wanted, and he just gave Obama nothing but grief.
I have no idea, but I found him a very difficult person to deal with.
Here's another person you're closer to. How about your take on Susan Rice?
Well, Susan Rice, I have known since she was a little girl. She went to, first of all, I was really good friends with her mother, Lois Rice, because we did a lot of things together. And actually, Susan is in age between my twins and my youngest daughter. And we all used to, and my former husband played tennis with her father, and we spent a lot of time together. So I have known Susan for a very long time. I think she is an incredibly capable person. Officially, we kind of, she was in the White House in the National Security Council staff for President Clinton. And then when I was in office, she was Assistant Secretary for African Affairs. She was terrific in that. And she is really, really smart and a very capable human being.
Who is the leader of the free world today?
And that's a hard question. I actually think probably Angela Merkel in so many ways, in the way she thinks. And she is steady. She works well with others. They are president of the G7 at the moment. And I think she's a really very careful and smart political person. And I'm sorry that she's decided that she's not going to stay in office for more than a year.
When you look around the world today, Madam Secretary, what do you see as the greatest threat from the foreign policy point of view to the United States today?
The greatest threat is, in many ways, our behavior, if I may say so, and I've said that. But I do think our kind of what the whole issue is on intelligence as a whole. How hacking, the various technology, cyber weapons, that we have really no rules for the whole intelligence sector and the trading of information, and then also how cyber works. We're having a lot of trouble at the moment even getting normal arms control agreements. But I think that the whole issue of cyber, the offense and the defense, and understanding how artificial intelligence does work, will work, who penetrates whose country, all those kinds of aspects in terms of that know no borders. I also do think that the virus and what it has done in not only in terms of health, but kind of making clear that we don't have good systems to try to deal with something that knows no borders.
And how would you rate, finally, the response of the United States to the coronavirus pandemic, to what some of our other countries, particularly our allies, have done?
Well, I think we've screwed up. I am so tired of the president taking credit for the best, whatever. It's the worst country now in terms of what the number of cases, the disagreements in terms of what the guidelines are, trying to figure out how the governments relate to the people and the economy. And there are other countries that have done very well. By the way, what's interesting, some of the countries that really have done well are the ones that are run by women.
Bill Press with Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State and author, most recently, of Hell and Other Destinations. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Theda Skocpol, Melvin Goodman, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.